Welcome, gentle listener, to our quiet corner of the world, a space crafted for tranquility and rest. Before we begin our journey tonight, we invite you to settle in, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and allow your breathing to deepen and slow. The stories we share here are designed to be soft companions in the moments just before sleep, to soothe the mind and untangle the knots of a long day. If you find comfort in this place, consider subscribing to our channel. By doing so, you help us continue to create these peaceful sanctuaries for others, and you ensure you'll never miss a chance to unwind with us. Now, close your eyes, let go of the world outside, and let us travel together to a place of gentle mystery, to the whispering willow tree. The world had become too loud for Elias. It was a cacophony of sharp edges and relentless demands. A constant hum of notifications, deadlines, and expectations that buzzed beneath his skin from morning until night. He felt frayed, like a well-loved rope that had been pulled taut for too long, its fibers beginning to snap one by one. It was this deep, soul-level weariness that led him to Viridia Hollow. He hadn't sought it out specifically, rather, he had simply driven, turning down roads that looked quieter, more forgotten, until the concrete gave way to gravel, and the gravel thinned into a dirt track flanked by overgrown hedges thick with wildflowers. The town itself was little more than a whisper, a handful of stone cottages with smoke curling lazily from their chimneys, a general store with a faded wooden sign, and a profound, enveloping silence that was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of a cow. It felt like a place that time had respectfully decided to step around. His rented cottage was at the very edge of the hollow, bordering a vast, rolling meadow. It was on his third day, after a long and dreamless sleep, that he decided to explore this meadow. The morning air was cool and smelled of damp earth, clover, and something sweetly floral he couldn't name. Dew clung to every blade of grass, sparkling like a carpet of tiny diamonds under the soft, rising sun. He walked without a destination, his boots making soft, rhythmic impressions in the soil. The gentle slope of the land guided him downward, toward a small, meandering stream whose gurgling was the only music in the quiet air. And there, beside the stream, stood the tree. It was a willow, but a willow of an impossible age and grandeur. Its trunk was thick and gnarled, a colossal column of gray-brown bark that looked as though it had been twisted into shape by the patient hands of centuries. Great, heavy boughs wept downward, their long, slender branches forming a dense, sweeping curtain of green that brushed against the tall grasses and kissed the surface of the water. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, creating a dappled, shifting mosaic of light and shadow on the ground beneath. It wasn't just a tree, it was a cathedral of living wood, a self-contained world of profound peace. Elias felt an irresistible pull, a silent invitation. He ducked under a low-hanging bough, parting the leafy curtain, and stepped into the space within. The air here was cooler, hushed. The sound of the stream was muffled, the light softer, greener. It felt like stepping into a sacred, hidden room. The ground was a soft carpet of moss and fallen leaves, and the immense trunk rose up in the center like a pillar supporting a green sky. He ran his hand over the bark. It was rough in some places, smooth in others, a topography of its long life etched with fissures and knobs. He felt a sense of history that was almost palpable, a feeling of being in the presence of something that had witnessed more than any human ever could. He settled himself at its base, his back resting against the solid, reassuring wood. He closed his eyes, not intending to do anything but listen to the water and feel the gentle breeze. But as he sat there, a new sound began to weave itself into the gentle symphony of the meadow. It was the rustling of the willow's leaves, a sound he had heard 1,000 times before from other trees. Yet, this was different. It wasn't just the mindless shiver of foliage in the wind. There was a cadence to it, a rhythm. It sounded almost like a whisper, a long, drawn-out sigh that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken words. Elias dismissed it as fancy, a product of his tired, over-imaginative mind, but the feeling lingered, a sense that the tree was aware of his presence, and that it had something to say. He stayed for over an hour, and when he finally rose to leave, a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years had settled deep within his bones. The world's noise seemed a little farther away. The pull of the willow tree was undeniable. The following afternoon, Elias found himself walking the same path through the meadow, drawn back to the green sanctuary he had discovered. The sun was higher now, warmer, and the air was alive with the drowsy hum of bees flitting between patches of purple thistle and white yarrow. He carried a small flask of cool water and a worn paperback. But he knew, deep down, that he wouldn't read. He was coming to listen. He ducked beneath the same sweeping branches, the leaves brushing softly against his face like a gentle greeting. He settled into the same spot at the base of the trunk, the earth seeming to mold itself to his form as if it remembered him. He closed his eyes and focused his attention, not on the stream or the insects, but on the leaves. He let his mind go quiet, open, and receptive. At first, there was only the wind, a soft, sighing breeze that made the long branches sway in a slow, hypnotic dance. But then, as his concentration deepened, the sound began to change. The rustling coalesced, the myriad of individual leaves whispering together to form a single, coherent murmur. It was not a voice of words, not in English or any language he could name, but a voice of feeling, of images that bloomed directly into his mind. It was like remembering a dream he'd never had. The first story began to unfold, soft and faded as an old photograph. He saw a young woman and a young man, their clothes suggesting a time a century or more past. Her name floated into his consciousness, Alara. She had hair the color of spun gold, tied back with a simple blue ribbon, and her laughter was as clear and bright as the stream beside them. The young man was Finn, tall and earnest, with kind eyes and hands calloused from farm work. This Willow, younger then but still grand, was their place. The images the tree shared were not a linear narrative, but a collection of sensory moments. Elias felt the warmth of the sun on Alara's face as she leaned against the trunk, weaving a crown of daisies. He felt the nervous energy in Finn's hands as he held a small pocket knife, his gaze fixed on the bark. The whispering leaves showed Elias the moment Finn carefully carved their initials into the trunk, an EA+ sign, and an F enclosed within a lopsided heart. It wasn't a perfect carving, but it was made with a reverence that was deeply moving. The tree shared the memory of the pressure of the blade, not as a wound, but as an accepted mark of devotion, a story entrusted to its care. He heard the echo of their promises, not in words, but in the emotional resonance they left behind. A promise to meet here every midsummer's eve, a promise to build a life together in the hollow, a promise of a love as enduring as the tree itself. The story was simple, devoid of grand drama or tragedy. It was a tale of quiet, steadfast love. Elias could almost smell the scent of Alara's wildflower perfume, feel the solidness of Finn's hand holding hers. The tree shared the memory of them growing older, returning year after year, their hair grayed, their steps slowed, but their hands still found each other as they sat in the shade of the branches. The last image was of them as an elderly couple, leaning not just on the tree, but on each other, their faces etched with the peaceful lines of a shared life well lived. When the whispers faded back into the simple rustle of the wind, Elias opened his eyes. The sun was lower in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the meadow. He felt a profound sense of peace, tinged with a sweet, gentle melancholy. He looked at the gnarled bark beside him, and though decades of new growth had warped and softened the image, he could just make out the faint, ancient shapes of an E and an F forever held in the heart of the willow. He had been given a gift, A forgotten story, and he knew he would be back for more. A soft, gray mist blanketed Viridia Hollow the next morning. It clung to the valley, muffling all sound and turning the world into a soft-focused watercolor painting. Elias, wrapped in a warm sweater, felt it was the perfect weather for another visit to the Willow. The dampness in the air seemed to amplify the sense of the meadow, the rich, loamy smell of the earth, the sharp, clean fragrance of wet leaves. The journey to the tree felt even more like entering a secret world, with the mist parting before him and closing in behind, isolating him completely with his thoughts and the quiet landscape. When he reached the willow, its vast form loomed out of the gray, its weeping branches dripping with moisture, each drop landing on the mossy ground with a soft, percussive tap. He entered the green enclosure, which felt even more insulated and sacred in the mist. The air was still and heavy. He sat, leaned back, and closed his eyes, his breathing falling into a slow, meditative rhythm. He didn't have to wait long. The whispers started almost immediately, not as a story of people this time, but as a feeling, a profound and gentle loneliness, the kind that only a small child can feel. Then, the images began to form in his mind, clearer than before. He saw a little girl, no older than 7. Her name was Lily. She had big, curious brown eyes and 2 dark braids that bounced as she walked. The tree remembered her frequent visits, especially on days like this, when the world felt a little sad and gray. She wasn't a sad child by nature, but a quiet one, an observer in a world that often moved too fast for her. For Lily, the willow tree wasn't just a tree, it was her confidant, her castle, her giant, silent friend. The whispers shared the memory of her small hands, pressed flat against the rough bark as she told it her secrets. She would whisper about the bigger children at the village school who wouldn't let her join their games, about a beautiful butterfly she had seen that morning, about the taste of the wild strawberries she had found near the stream. The tree had held them all, every whispered secret, every quiet observation, storing them in the deep, slow memory of its wood. The central part of this memory, the heart of the story the tree wanted to share, was about a small, carved wooden bird. It was her most treasured possession, a gift from her grandfather. It was simple, unpainted, but its shape was perfect, and it fit snugly in the palm of her hand. One afternoon, while playing a game of make-believe where the bird was a magical messenger, she had set it down in a hollow between 2 of the willow's large, exposed roots. She got distracted by a vibrant dragonfly hovering over the stream, and in her excitement, she forgot all about the bird. It wasn't until she was home, tucked in her bed, that a cold dread washed over her. She had lost it. The tree shared Lily's frantic return the next day, her little face streaked with tears as she searched every nook and cranny around the base of the trunk. But the bird was gone. A heavy rain the night before had washed a fresh layer of leaves and soil over the hollow in the roots, concealing it completely. The tree shared the memory of her profound, childish grief, a sorrow that felt immense and overwhelming. She sat for a long time, crying softly into her knees, before whispering a final, sad goodbye to her lost friend and trudging home. But the tree knew the bird was not truly lost. It was safe, nestled in the earth, protected by the roots. The whispers conveyed a sense of guardianship, of holding this small, precious thing in trust. The memory wasn't a sad one. It was a testament to the quiet dramas that unfold in the lives of children, and the silent, steadfast presence of nature that bears witness to them. As the story concluded, Elias felt a pang of empathy for the little girl. He opened his eyes and looked down at the base of the tree. The roots were like great, gnarled knuckles breaking through the earth. He ran his hand over the moss-covered ground, imagining a small wooden bird still sleeping peacefully beneath the soil, a secret kept by the willow for decades. The mist had begun to lift, and a pale, Watery sunlight was filtering through the leaves, making the wet moss gleam like emerald velvet. The loneliness of the story was replaced by a sense of enduring care and gentle protection. The days in Viridia Hollow began to take on a gentle, predictable rhythm for Elias. Morning was for quiet contemplation and coffee on the cottage porch. The afternoons were for the willow tree, and the evenings were for simple meals and deep, restful sleep. The noise in his head had subsided from a roar to a distant hum. And sometimes, for long, blissful stretches, it disappeared entirely. On the fifth day, a strong, blustering wind swept through the valley. It wasn't a violent storm, but a boisterous, playful gale that sent clouds scudding across the sky and made the entire meadow dance. He felt a different kind of energy in the air as he made his way to the willow. The tree was a vortex of motion, its thousands of branches swaying and whipping in the wind, creating a rushing, roaring sound like a waterfall. He found his usual shelter within the curtain of leaves. Here, the wind's force was broken, transformed into a series of powerful gusts that made the whole structure of the tree creak and groan around him. It felt like being in the cabin of a great, ancient ship, sailing through a sea of air. He leaned against the trunk, feeling the deep vibrations of its resistance to the wind. He closed his eyes, and the whispers that came today were different. They were not a narrative of events or emotions, but a story of pure thought, a memory of intellectual sanctuary. The image that formed was of a man from a much older time, perhaps the late 17th or early 18th century. He was a scholar, dressed in dark, well-worn traveling clothes. His name was not given, but his essence was clear, a mind burdened with knowledge and a deep, complex problem. He was on foot, carrying a heavy satchel filled with leather-bound books. A sudden, cold downpour had driven him to seek shelter, and he had found it here, under the then mature willow. The tree remembered the scent of old paper and rain-soaked wool. It remembered the man's exhaustion, not just of the body, but of the mind. The scholar didn't sit to rest idly. He pulled out a small, vellum-bound journal and a piece of charcoal and began to sketch. Not pictures, but diagrams and equations. He was wrestling with a concept of celestial mechanics, a puzzle of planetary motion that had eluded him for months. The tree's whispers conveyed the frantic, circular nature of his thoughts, the frustration of hitting the same intellectual wall again and again. The rain drummed down on the canopy above, a relentless, percussive rhythm, and the wind howled outside the leafy shelter. But inside, there was a strange and profound calm. The tree did not offer him a solution. It offered something more valuable, a perfect space for his own mind to work. The rhythmic drumming of the rain, the deep groaning of the wood, the feeling of being enclosed and protected from the elements, all of it worked to strip away the unessential, to quiet the panicked, frustrated parts of his intellect. The tree shared the memory of the moment of breakthrough. It wasn't a sudden flash of lightning, but a slow, quiet dawn of understanding, a key variable he had overlooked, a flawed assumption he had been making. The scholar's hand, which had been still for a long time, suddenly began to move, the charcoal flying across the page. A new diagram took shape, elegant and simple, a wave of profound relief and quiet, triumphant joy washed through him. Elias, sitting in the same spot centuries later, felt a shadow of that intellectual release. He understood that the willow's gift was not always in the stories it told, but in the environment it created. It was a catalyst for peace, for inspiration, for clarity. The memory shared by the tree was one of stillness in the midst of a storm. A quiet space where a complex thought could finally untangle itself and find its truth. The scholar had eventually packed his journal, bowed his head in a gesture of silent thanks to the tree, and continued on his journey, his step lighter, his mind clear. When the whispers subsided, Elias was left with the sound of the wind, which now seemed less like a roar and more like a powerful, cleansing breath. He felt as though some of his own tangled thoughts had been smoothed out, simply by bearing witness to the scholar's long-ago moment of peace. As the week wore on, Elias began to realize that the willow's memories were not limited to the human lives that had touched it. The tree was a silent witness to the entire life of the meadow. Its memory a deep, rich tapestry woven with threads of flora and fauna, of seasons and silence. One afternoon, the air was particularly still and heavy with the warmth of impending summer. The sky was a vast, cloudless dome of brilliant blue. The meadow was quiet, save for the incessant, hypnotic chirping of cicadas. It was a day that felt ancient, steeped in the slow, patient time of the natural world. Elias approached the willow, feeling a deep sense of belonging, as if he were visiting an old and trusted friend. He settled in his usual place, the ground now feeling as familiar as his own armchair. He closed his eyes and let the heat of the day lull him into a state of deep relaxation. Today, the whispers came without any human presence at all. They were primal, wordless, and profoundly gentle. The tree was sharing a memory from a time before Viridia Hollow was more than just a single farmstead. A time when the meadow was wilder, more untamed. The first sensation was one of heightened alertness, a soft, cautious tension. The tree was sharing the senses of a doe, her coat the color of dried ferns. She was heavy with child, and she had sought out the deep, protective shade of the willow's curtain as a safe place to give birth. Elias felt the doe's instincts, the twitch of her ears at every distant sound, the constant scanning of the horizon with her large, liquid brown eyes, the deep, primal urge to find a hidden, secure place. The willow had offered its sanctuary without question. The memory was filled with the sense of the forest floor, the taste of tender leaves, and the feeling of the earth, cool and solid, beneath her weary body. Then came the memory of the birth itself. It was not presented as a clinical or frightening event, but as a quiet, natural miracle. The tree shared the doe's soft, guttural sounds, the strain and the final, gentle release. A tiny fawn, impossibly small and fragile, lay glistening in the dappled light. It was all legs and enormous, dark eyes, its coat spotted like the sun-dappled ground it lay upon. The tree's memory was filled with the overwhelming, fierce love of the mother. It shared the sensation of her rough tongue cleaning the newborn, stimulating its breath, nudging it to life. For the first few hours of its life, the fawn's entire world was the space beneath the willow. As the fawn attempted its first wobbly, uncertain steps, the leaves of the willow rustled in a breeze that was too gentle to be felt outside the canopy. The whisper that Elias heard was not a story, but a song. It was a wordless lullaby, a shushing, rustling chorus that seemed to calm the newborn animal. The tree was singing to it, a song of safety, a song of welcome. It was the same sound Elias had been listening to for days. But now he understood it in a new context. It was the tree's native language, a language of pure, soothing sound. The memory was of the fawn, finally steady on its spindly legs, nursing from its mother in the green, peaceful light, while the willow sang its ancient, leafy lullaby over them. When Elias opened his eyes, the afternoon sun was just as bright, the cicadas just as loud, but the world felt different, more sacred. He had been allowed to witness a moment of pure, unadulterated life, a secret ritual of the wild. He understood now that the willow was not just a repository of human stories, but a guardian of life itself. In all its forms, it offered shelter to the lover, the child, the scholar, and the doe with equal, silent generosity. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for this perspective, for being shown a world that existed alongside his own, a world of instinct, survival, and quiet, profound beauty. He listened to the rustling of the leaves above him, and for the first time, he felt he could almost understand the melody. Elias awoke one morning with a familiar, unwelcome feeling, a knot of creative frustration. Before his retreat to Viridia Hollow, he had been a writer, but the words had long since dried up, leaving him feeling hollowed out and useless. The pressure to produce, to be brilliant, had become a crushing weight. He had hoped the peace of the hollow would help, but so far, he had felt no inclination to even open his journal. Today, however, that frustration felt different, less like a barren desert and more like a tense, coiled spring. He decided to take this feeling with him to the Willow, to see what its whispers might offer. The day was bright and clear, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the coming of autumn. As he sat beneath the familiar green canopy, he consciously laid his frustration bare, offering it up to the ancient presence of the tree. He closed his eyes and listened, and the story that emerged felt like it was meant specifically for him. It was the memory of an artist, a young woman named Clara, from perhaps 70 or 80 years ago. The tree remembered Clara arriving in a state of agitated despair. She carried a large sketchpad and a box of charcoals, which she threw onto the grass with a sigh of exasperation. The whispers conveyed her inner turmoil with vivid clarity, the feeling of being blocked, the self-doubt, the fear that her talent had abandoned her. She was a painter, and she had come to the countryside to find inspiration, but had found only a deeper sense of her own inadequacy. She paced back and forth in the small clearing, her movements sharp and angry, a stark contrast to the Willow's placid grace. She sat, she stood, she ran her hands through her cropped, dark hair in frustration. Then, she simply stopped, exhausted by her own internal battle. She finally surrendered and just sat, leaning her head back against the trunk, her eyes half closed. She wasn't looking for anything anymore. And that is when she began to see. The tree shared her shifting perception. Her artist's eye, no longer clouded by the pressure to create, began to absorb the world around her. She saw the way the sunlight wasn't just a uniform brightness, but a complex, shifting dance of light. It filtered through the countless leaves, creating layers of luminosity. Some leaves were bright, almost white with direct sun. Others were a deep, translucent emerald, and those in shadow were a cool, dark jade. The whispers conveyed her growing excitement, the quickening of her pulse. It wasn't the tree itself that was the subject, but the light that it shaped. She saw the patterns it cast upon the ground, a constantly moving mosaic of bright patches and soft, blurry shadows. She saw the way the light caught the surface of the stream, shattering into 1,000 glittering, moving points. The world under the willow was not a static scene, but a living, breathing entity of light and color and movement. The memory of her frustration dissolved, replaced by a feverish need to capture what she was seeing. Her hands, once clenched in anger, now moved with purpose. She snatched up her sketchpad and charcoal, and the tree remembered the frantic, rhythmic scratch of the charcoal on paper. She wasn't drawing a tree, she was drawing light and shadow, form and absence. Elias could feel her joy, the pure, unadulterated bliss of creative flow. It was the joy of connection, of finally being able to translate the beauty of the world outside into a language that was her own. She worked for hours, filling page after page, completely lost in her work. The willow held the memory of her quiet, triumphant smile as she looked at her sketches, her face smudged with charcoal, her eyes shining with renewed purpose. When the memory faded, Elias opened his eyes and saw the willow with a new perspective. He saw what Clara had seen, the infinite complexity of the light, the subtle shifts in color, the gentle, constant motion. The knot of his own frustration had loosened, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning sense of hope. He hadn't found the words for his story yet, but the willow had reminded him that inspiration doesn't come from forcing it. It comes from surrender, from quiet observation, and from allowing the world to reveal its own stories to you. For the first time in months, he felt the gentle, tentative urge to write. The days grew shorter, and a distinct chill began to settle in the evening air. The first tinges of yellow and gold were appearing at the edges of the willow's leaves. Autumn was arriving in Viridia Hollow, not with a sudden announcement, but with a slow, graceful transition. Elias felt the change in himself as well. The frantic energy of his former life felt like a distant memory, replaced by a slower, more deliberate way of being. He had started writing again, not with any grand ambition, but simply for the pleasure of it, filling a journal with observations, fragments of thought, and echoes of the Willow's stories. This afternoon, as he made his way to the tree, he felt a deep curiosity. He wondered about the tree's own life, its own perception. All the stories it had shared were from the perspective of its visitors, filtered through their senses and emotions. What did the world feel like to the tree itself? As if in answer to his unasked question, the whispers that greeted him today were different from all the others. They were vast, slow, and cyclical, a story not of a single moment, but of the endless turning of time. The willow was sharing its own memory of the seasons. The story began with the very autumn he was now experiencing. It was a sensation of letting go. Elias felt a slow, deliberate withdrawal of energy from the thousands of leaves. A peaceful, willing release. It wasn't a death, but a preparation for rest. He felt the sharp, crisp bite of the first frost on his branches. A pleasant, bracing shock. He experienced the wind not as a force to be resisted, but as a partner in a dance, helping to shed the golden brown leaves, sending them spinning to the ground to form a thick, insulating blanket over its roots. The whispers conveyed a sense of deep satisfaction, of a job well done. A long summer's work of converting sun into life now complete. Then came the slow descent into winter. This was a memory of profound silence and stillness. Elias felt the heavy weight of the first snow, not as a burden, but as a soft, protective cloak. The world, as seen by the tree, became a simplified landscape of white and gray. The babbling stream was hushed, its edges frozen into intricate patterns of ice. The whispers were of a deep, internal slumber. The tree's consciousness turned inward, into the slow, almost imperceptible pulse of life deep within its wooden heart. It was a time of immense peace, of dreaming in wood and root. A long, slow breath held for months. It wasn't empty or lonely, it was full of a quiet, dormant power, a gathering of strength, with a slowness that was impossible for a human mind to truly grasp. The feeling began to shift. A new warmth, deep in the earth, began to stir the roots. Spring. The memory was an explosion of feeling, a powerful, irresistible upward surge of sap. Elias felt the life force rushing through every bough and branch. A tingling, vibrant energy. He felt the buds on his twigs swelling, straining, and finally bursting forth into tiny, tender, brilliant green leaves. It was a memory of pure, unbridled renewal, of stretching and unfurling after a long sleep. The air filled with the scent of damp earth and the chorus of returning birds, who found familiar homes among its branches. Finally, the cycle turned to summer, the season of fullness and maturity. This was a memory of placid, sun-drenched contentment. The leaves were broad and dark, working tirelessly in the long hours of daylight. Elias felt the sensation of providing deep, cool shade, a haven from the midday heat for sheep, for humans, for all the small creatures of the meadow. He felt the gentle patter of a summer rain shower on his canopy, a refreshing drink that washed his leaves clean. It was a season of quiet, powerful generosity, of being fully and completely what he was, a great, life-giving willow. As the memory of summer faded and blended back into the feeling of the present autumn, Elias was left with a sense of awe. He had just experienced a year, or perhaps 100 years, in the life of the tree. He understood that its perception of time was utterly different from his own. For the willow, time was not a linear race, but a beautiful, endless circle of rest, renewal, work, and release. He felt his own anxieties about time, about wasted years and looming deadlines, melt away, dwarfed by this immense, patient perspective. He was a brief visitor in its long, cyclical life, and that knowledge was not diminishing, but deeply, profoundly comforting. The stories of the willow had become a part of Elias's own inner landscape. He carried the lover's promise, the artist's breakthrough, and the scholar's peace with him. But one story lingered more than others, the memory of the lonely little girl, Lily, who had lost her wooden bird. He often wondered what became of her, if she ever found the same comfort under the willow's branches as an adult. One cool, clear afternoon, when the autumn colors were at their peak, painting the hollow in fiery shades of orange, red, and gold, the willow gave him the answer. He settled into his sanctuary, the rustling leaves now a familiar and beloved voice. He closed his eyes and listened, and a feeling of gentle finality, of peaceful closure, washed over him. The whispers began, and he saw Lily again. But she was no longer a little girl. The image that formed in his mind was of an old woman. Her face a beautiful map of wrinkles. Her dark hair now a soft, snowy white. She moved slowly, with the aid of a smooth, polished wooden cane, but her brown eyes, though faded with age, still held the same quiet, observant spark. It was unmistakably Lily. Nearly 80 years later, the tree shared the memory of her final visit. She did not come in sorrow or distress. She came with a sense of purpose, of pilgrimage. She carefully lowered herself to the ground, her movements deliberate, and leaned against the trunk in the same way she had as a child. The whispers were imbued with her thoughts, a stream of quiet gratitude. She wasn't speaking aloud, but her feelings flowed out to the tree, her oldest friend. She thanked it for being a constant, unchanging presence in her life of constant change. She remembered hiding from her brothers in its leafy curtain. She remembered a first, shy kiss shared in its shade as a teenager. She remembered bringing her own children here for picnics, and then her grandchildren, pointing out the best branches for climbing. The willow had been the silent backdrop to her entire life, a witness to her joys, her heartbreaks, her quiet moments of contemplation. The tree's memory of her was not a single story, but a lifetime of them, all layered one upon the other. And then, her thoughts turned to the small, lost wooden bird. The tree shared her gentle, smiling recollection. She no longer felt the sharp grief of its loss, but a fond, sweet nostalgia. In her mind, the bird had never been truly lost. The willow had simply kept it for her, guarding her childhood treasure. The idea had brought her comfort throughout her life, the knowledge that a piece of her innocence was kept safe in the earth, under the protection of her guardian tree. She stayed for a long time, not speaking, not moving, simply being present with the willow. The memory was one of profound peace, of a life coming full circle. It was not a sad goodbye, but a graceful one. It was an acknowledgement of a long and beautiful friendship between a human soul and a wooden one. Before she left, she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, smooth, gray stone from the stream. She pressed it gently into the same hollow in the roots where she had once lost her bird. It was a parting gift, a final token of her affection, a small piece of permanence to leave with the ancient being that had given her so much. The last image the tree shared was of her walking away, her back straight, her steps slow but steady, disappearing into the golden light of the late afternoon. Elias opened his eyes, a lump in his throat. He felt he had been given the end of the story, a perfect and beautiful conclusion. He looked down at the roots and could almost imagine the smooth, gray stone resting somewhere deep in the soil, a companion to the little wooden bird. The whispers had shown him that endings did not have to be sad. They could be quiet, grateful, and full of a peaceful, accepting love. The sun was setting, and the entire meadow was bathed in a soft, rose gold light. As Elias's time in Viridia Hollow neared its end, He noticed a shift in the stories the Willow shared. They became less about individuals and more about the collective, as if the tree were showing him how all the individual threads of life were woven together into a larger community tapestry. One particularly beautiful afternoon, with the air so still and clear it felt like the world was holding its breath, he went for what he knew would be one of his last visits. The sense of melancholy was there, but it was gentle, outweighed by an immense feeling of gratitude for the gifts he had received in this place. He settled under the branches, and as the whispers began, he was not shown a single person or linear story. Instead, he was immersed in a mosaic of shared happiness. The tree was sharing its memory of a village picnic from a long ago midsummer's day. It was a time of simple prosperity and communal peace, perhaps in the years after a great war, when the value of simple joy was at its peak. The memory was a symphony of sensory details. Elias could hear the sound of it first, a gentle hum of human contentment. There was the distant, cheerful melody of an accordion, the rhythmic clapping of hands, and the bright, high-pitched peals of children's laughter as they played tag around the massive trunk. He could hear the low murmur of conversation, snippets of gossip, stories being shared, friendly arguments over a game of checkers played on a blanket. It was the sound of a community at ease with itself, knitted together by shared history and genuine affection. Then came the smells. The tree remembered the scent of freshly cut grass, of clover crushed underfoot. It remembered the delicious aroma of food laid out on checkered blankets, warm bread, sharp cheese, sweet apple pies, and lemonade. These scents mingled with the perfume of the wildflowers in the meadow and the clean, earthy fragrance of the stream. It was the smell of abundance, of simple pleasures, of a perfect summer day. The images were a whirlwind of gentle, happy moments. The tree saw it all from its central, unmoving vantage point. It saw young couples sneaking away to steal a kiss behind its weeping branches. It saw old men in straw hats, leaning back against its trunk, eyes closed, just listening to the happy noise. It saw a group of women sharing a bottle of dandelion wine, their faces relaxed and smiling. It saw a small boy, mesmerized, watching a caterpillar inch its way up a willow leaf. It saw a toddler taking her first steps on the soft grass, her parents' faces alight with pride and joy. The willow wasn't focusing on any one story. It was the silent, benevolent witness to all of them at once. It held the collective joy of that day, the warmth of the sun, the sweetness of the food, the comfort of companionship. The whispers conveyed a sense of the tree itself taking pleasure in the scene, absorbing the happiness of the humans who had gathered in its shade. It was like the sun storing light. The tree was storing joy. The memory was not about anything happening, it was about the simple, profound beauty of people being together, being happy, being at peace. There was no drama, no conflict, just a perfect, sun-drenched afternoon of community. When the memory slowly dissolved back into the quiet of the present day, Elias felt warm from the inside out. He felt as if he, too, had been a guest at that long-ago picnic. The willow had shown him that its role was not just to witness the solitary moments of individuals, but to be the heart of a community, a central point around which life, in all its simple glory, unfolded. It was a reminder that while individual stories are precious, the shared story of community is just as vital and beautiful. He felt less like a solitary visitor and more like the latest in a long, unbroken line of people who had found a moment of peace in the willow's embrace. His last day in Viridia Hollow arrived, a day of mixed emotions. A part of him felt the familiar pull of the life he had left behind, the responsibilities he had to return to. But a much larger part of him felt a deep reluctance to leave this sanctuary of silence and stories. The noise of the world, he knew, would be waiting, but something inside him had fundamentally changed. He was no longer the frayed, anxious man who had arrived weeks ago. He felt calmer, more centered, as if the slow, patient rhythm of the hollow had seeped into his very being. He decided to make one final visit to the willow, not to ask for another story, but to say thank you and goodbye. The afternoon was cool and overcast. The sky a soft, uniform gray. It felt appropriate, a quiet, contemplative day for a farewell. He walked the path through the meadow slowly, memorizing the feel of the earth beneath his feet, the scent of the air, the way the muted light fell on the golden grasses. He parted the leafy curtain for the last time and stepped into the green, hushed world within. The air was still and smelled of damp leaves and rich soil. He sat down in his familiar spot, the indentation in the earth feeling like it was made just for him. He leaned back against the ancient, gnarled trunk and, for the first time, he didn't close his eyes. He just looked, and he listened with his whole being. He did not ask for a story, and the tree did not offer one. There were no images of the past, no echoes of other lives. Instead, there was a different kind of communication, a silent, profound communion. The rustling of the leaves was just a rustle, the creak of the wood just a creak. But in that simple reality, he felt the tree's presence more powerfully than ever before. He felt its immense age, its deep, slow life, its steadfast endurance. He reflected on all the stories it had shared with him, the lovers, the child, the scholar, the artist, the doe, the old woman, the joyful community. They weren't just stories anymore. They were part of him now, woven into his own understanding of time, of love, of loss, and of peace. He realized the greatest gift the willow had given him was not the escape from his own life, but a new perspective on it. His own worries and struggles, which had once seemed so immense and all-consuming, now felt smaller, placed in the context of the centuries of life the tree had witnessed. His life was just one story among thousands, one leaf on a colossal, ancient tree. This realization was not diminishing, it was liberating. It freed him from the tyranny of his own ego, from the belief that his problems were the center of the universe. He was part of a much larger, longer, and gentler story. He sat there for a long time, in perfect, comfortable silence. He felt the solidness of the trunk against his back, a silent reassurance. He watched the way the light, dim as it was, still managed to find its way through the dense canopy, creating soft patterns on the ground. He listened to the gurgle of the stream, a constant, soothing presence. He had found what he came for. The quiet he had been seeking was not in the absence of sound, but in the presence of this deep, abiding peace. Finally, it was time to go. He stood up and placed his palm flat against the rough bark, a gesture he had seen in the tree's own memories. "Thank you," he whispered, and this time, the words were his own. He felt a deep, pulsing sense of acknowledgement from the tree, a feeling of farewell and well-wishing. Following Lily's example, he picked up a small, perfectly smooth, dark stone from the edge of the stream. He placed it carefully in a nook between two large roots, a small offering of his own, a listener's gift. He took one last look at the magnificent, weeping form of the willow, then turned and walked away, not looking back. He knew he was taking the willow's peace with him, a quiet, rustling whisper he could now carry within his own heart, ready for whatever came next. And that night, for the first time in a very long time, he fell asleep easily, his mind quiet and his dreams gentle and deep.